On the way to Rudder Mill Road, we passed the burn site of 1st Congressional, and I willed myself not to look at the copse of trees beyond it. We eventually took a right on Rudder Mill, a highway running east and west of the northern city limits of Chancellor. Cornfield slipped past on my left, while Chancellor went about its business about a quarter-mile down the intersecting highways to our right. "This is it," Vicky said, and I turned the car onto a gravel road with a sign pointing north that read, "Sacred Alignment." "What's Sacred Alignment?" I asked. "Cemetery," Vicky replied. "Is that where Cantor lives?" I replied with a smile. "I don't think it was a vampire horse," she chuckled. "Well, I mean, who knows? Maybe it was. You know, when I talked to my mom after I called you that day, she said that when I was a kid I made a whole bunch of little comic strips about Cantor. No memory of that." "There's your $1,000,000 idea," I replied. "Polish them up and put them online." "Oh, this is the house," she said suddenly. Not 100 feet past the turn sat 535 Rudder Mill Road, a 2-story ivory-colored farmhouse that had seen considerably better days. It was exactly what you'd expect when someone says farmhouse. The former home to the Parsons family was a time capsule of sorts. Not in disarray so much, but certainly not something that would appear on House Hunters anytime soon. A wraparound porch made its way about 20 feet around the side of the house, and you could see from the broad dirt beds along the front and down the side of the house that it was once landscaped. This house had been cared for at one time by its family. The curtains were drawn on 4 upstairs windows that faced the road, and a massive, long dead oak tree took up most of the side yard. At some point in its past, it had been split down the middle, probably lightning, and vegetation had grown to partially cover over the hollow center by about 8 or 9 feet off the ground. It was a bifurcated monolith to the tenacity of the place. We got out of the car as the breeze kicked up a little, and Vicky folded her arms against her chest, looking around. Even though Chancellor was just across the highway, little pockets of houses and a few businesses not a quarter-mile away, the house felt very isolated. To look at it, I don't think I necessarily would have known that it was uninhabited, even though the property was a bit unkempt. The aged wood of the porch beams moaned a little under my feet as I fished in the mailbox and pulled out a folded manila envelope. It did indeed contain the legal paperwork and a single key on a ring. I tried it on the front door deadbolt, and the tumblers chunked apart. Keys to the kingdom. Christ, if I'd known then what having that house was gonna do. Anyway, I stuffed the key in my pocket and made my way to the back of the house. To say it had a backyard would be an understatement, as the back of the house was home to a weathered, barn-style garage that looked on the verge of collapse. Beyond that, there was a long rectangular patch of earth that looked to have been a garden at one time. Past that, the beige canvas of field stretched out for maybe 1/8 of a mile or so, until a wide, thick expanse of dark trees gave way to dense woods. We stepped up on the back porch, just a concrete stoop with a few short steps. I tried the knob. It wouldn't turn, as though it was anchored from the other side with cement. So we made our way back around the house to the front. In the distance to the west was the husk of what had formerly been the McCann glass factory, a long, rectangular shadow on the horizon. "Do you have any desire to see the inside of this place?" I asked Vicky. "No point in stepping back now," she shrugged. So, I opened the front door, and in we went. The house was the same on the inside as it was on the outside. Unremarkable, but cozy, though age had laid a musty blanket over the entire place. Stepping inside, we were in a small foyer with a staircase on our right, a hallway leading to the kitchen right in front of us, and a living room on the left. The living room featured dated, modest furniture, flowery wallpaper, offering an attempt at cheer in this abandoned space. The cheer was tempered with a sense of exhaustion, and it didn't look like Rich had spent much, if any, time here at all, and there was visible dust on the stairs leading to the second floor, along with some dead bugs and a few leaves. If he'd explored the place, he'd left it as is so far. The kitchen was honest in its rustic quality. Wooden cabinets and a small dining table occupying the center of the room, and there was a brand new coffee maker on the counter that looked to have been used at least once, with a bag of coffee and a package of Oreos sitting nearby. I saw that the reason we couldn't come in through the kitchen was that a chair had been wedged under the doorknob. The upstairs was a small landing with 3 modest bedrooms and a narrow bathroom, and all of the doors stood open. They were all still furnished. I had to admit I felt a little weirded out when I realized I might have been looking at Tanner Parsons' bedroom, where she slept, where she looked out the window. Victoria appeared in the doorway behind me. "Did anyone live here after the Parsons?" I asked. "Not that I know of," she replied. "Hey, come here. I need your help getting the basement door open." I hadn't even noticed a basement door, blending into the wall between the kitchen and staircase. I pushed my shoulder against the frame while Vicky jimmied the knob, and we managed to work it free. The top hinge had started to come loose, which wedged the bottom of the door to the ground, and we forced it open. I decided I'd have to keep it that way for the time being. "You want to lay odds there's an arcade down here?" Vicky joked. "At least a pool table and wet bar," I said. We made our way down the rickety wooden steps, and Vicky reached the bottom before I did. With a second-hand easy chair that had seen better days and a huge wooden table as the only furniture. A massive corkboard was mounted to the wall just inside the room, and on it, it looked like the world's biggest conspiracy theorist had thrown up all manner of Clue and Blind Alley. It looked like those boards you saw in cop shows with strings leading to photos, symbols sketched on notebook paper, newspaper clippings, and all manner of ephemera. There were pictures of kids, stuff from magazines, printouts from websites, and in the middle, a giant map of Illinois with dots, lines, and numbers chicken scratched from one end to the other. That symbol that kept appearing to me was carefully drawn at the top of the map, along with some others, and underneath it the word Burci, B-U-R-C-I, was written in thick, black permanent marker. Near it was a series of additional symbols, lines and patterns, the occasional shape thrown in, all similar in their obscurity, but nothing to identify what they meant. My dad's handwriting clarified certain dots and lines with a little diagram or icon or note here and there. It was overwhelming. The clear product of years of research, none of it comforting. I could see Victoria studying the board intently, her eyes making connections from the get-go, and I pulled the chair out from the table. "Where do we start?" I asked. It was a loaded question. I mean, we could have started in 1,000 different places. As it was, we spent the hour that followed going through pictures that were both scattered on the table and pinned to the board. There were photos of Tanner Parsons that appeared to have come largely from some sort of photo archive, maybe the Chancellor newspapers, school documents, I don't know. And there were photos of Margaret Summers, which gave me more than a pause. My dad had disappeared from the motel at Swan Creek 12 weeks prior. Margaret Summers had only been missing for a week. So either my dad had been here within the last few days, which gave me some hope, or he had been positioning Margaret Summers in this strange series of events before she actually went missing. As Vicky and I pieced the timeline together, there was an unspoken concern between us, an inescapable consideration. Was my dad somehow involved, directly or indirectly, in this girl's disappearance? Vicky was able to identify most of the kids in the pictures. There was a class photo from the previous year with Margaret front and center, flashing a big grin, her hair in curls, and Vicky said that had been her class. There were also some Polaroids of a large metal enclosure for a bonfire that Vicky recognized right away. That's a place we just call the Pit, she explained. It's in Sunset Park, not that far from here. At the bottom of the Polaroid, my dad had scrawled a date. 10 days out from the current one. I asked Vicky if there was any significance to it, but she couldn't think of any. There were lots of pictures of the woods surrounding Chancellor, and a few I recognized even from my few moments out back, as the forested area behind the house that seemed to separate the north side of Chancellor from the rest of Baldwin County. There were photos of footprints in the mud, evidence of some animal, though for what purpose I couldn't say, as there were no accompanying notes. There were pieces of maps cut out, taped back together at different angles, recreations of maps on tracing paper laid over others, and in the middle of that table was a large recreation of my dad's roundabout that I'd discussed with Hugh, the concentric circle of dates, coordinates, and connected dots. Then Vicky found the verses. "Does this mean anything to you?" she asked before reading a quoted passage from the Bible. "And as we are sure that a man of piety and prayer enlists good angels on his side and engages them to perform toward him the ministrations of kindness, we know not why there cannot be such a thing as a man whose wickedness has caused his being abandoned by the Spirit of God, and who, in this desertion, has thrown open to evil angels the chambers of his soul." She paused. "There's a call number here. Photo of a page from a book called Secrets of the Black Arts. Sounds fake. It looks like the Chancellor Library. Was your dad a religious guy?" "Not really," I said. "Spiritual, maybe, but definitely not religious." "How about this one?" she said. "There came 2 angels to Sodom at evening, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them." Genesis 19. "Wait, what?" I replied quickly. "Say that again?" She looked puzzled, but repeated it. "There came 2 angels to Sodom at evening, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them." It's circled, and it says Genesis 19 under it. Though I'd never had one before, I felt for a moment the way I'd always heard panic attacks started, with a grip in my chest, similar to a heart attack, shortness of breath, dizziness. I placed my palms flat on the table and started taking deep breaths with my eyes closed when I felt Vicky's hand on my shoulder. "Paul," she said, "you're scaring me. What's wrong?" "I know that one," was all I could muster in response. Vicky sat back down across from me and rested her elbows on the table, thinking. "Should we call the police?" she asked. "Our chief of police is actually a good guy. No," I said, cutting her off. And tell them what? That my dad watched too many episodes of The X-Files? That he was researching missing kids in some bizarre way? Hell, I don't know what he was trying to do, and I don't think that having a picture of Chancellor's most recent missing child in this soup bowl will curry anything but suspicion. I think I should sift through this stuff a bit more. If we do end up having to take any of this to the police, it'll be better if we have something to bring them. I don't want my dad incriminated in anything. What if he is? She said quietly. I'm sorry, but what if he is? And what if we could help find Margaret as a result of whatever the hell this all is? "I know you're right," I replied weakly. "I need to get a handle on this somehow. Give me a day or two, just to go through what's here." "Okay," she said. "Then we'll do it together. I'm not just going to sit at home the whole time while you plow through the vault of horror here." I saw her tap away at her phone suddenly, then slip it in her purse. "Everything okay?" I replied. "Yeah, I'm just letting my mom know where I am." I must have looked puzzled, and it was Vicky's turn to get defensive. "Look, I barely know you, Paul, and I barely know your dad, and he clearly knows something about Margaret. Someone needs to know where I am." "Ever heard the phrase screw politeness?" "I have," I replied with a nod and a thumbs up. I began assembling a set of file folders that had dates by year on the tabs. "So from the look of these, he was in the process of organizing this stuff into some sort of chronological order. But he stopped, she said, pointing toward a messy pile of papers with no distinct structure or organization. He stopped, I agreed, and that's what we need to figure out. I paged through a printed out stack of land survey plats, some of them from Chancellor, some from nearby towns. And then I noticed Vicky squinting up at the board. "What is it?" I asked. "This," she said. She plucked a photo from the cork and held it up in front of her. "Look familiar?" The photo was a slightly blurry, rushed snapshot of the playhouse behind Van's property. From the light, it was tough to tell what time of day it was, but pre-dawn seemed the most likely. Through the cutout in the door, the shape of something or someone huddled inside was visible. I could see eyes. The quality of the photo made it impossible to determine if they were animal or human. I felt something deep down, a rush of adrenaline, that told me in a flash that my instincts so far had been correct. Either my dad snapped that picture on the sly, or Van had been lying when he said he hadn't met my dad. I was going to find out which one. I pulled the car along the side of the road about a quarter mile behind Van's house and killed the lights. We sat for a minute or so in the darkness, watching the house. From the back, it looked totally dark, but the sun had only just begun to set, and it seemed a little early for anyone to go to bed. "I think we should call the police," Vicky said. "I mean, it's probably a raccoon or something in that picture, you know? I just want to talk to him again, and I want to get a look inside that thing one more time," I replied. Vicky sighed. "So do we go full Law and Order on this and have me distract him while you get another look in the playhouse?" "No, I don't think we need to worry about that," I said. "I'm not worried about Van. I don't think there's any reason to be afraid here, is there? If he sees us, I can just say that I thought I dropped something when I was checking out the playhouse earlier and wanted to check and see." We got out of the car, and rather than making a beeline for Van's backyard, we cut about 10 feet into the trees and came out behind the playhouse, well out of sight for anyone who was even in the backyard unless they had a reason to look for us. Taken individually, my dad's pictures could have easily felt random to someone who didn't know him. But I knew there was a method to whatever he was doing. His life, his work, had been marked by an attention to detail. For the individual pieces of this to not line up somehow seemed impossible to me. Put simply, there had to be a reason he took that picture. I asked Vicky to keep an eye on the house while I crept around the front of the little structure and slipped inside, crouching uncomfortably as I did, and I eased the door closed behind me, leaning forward on my knees. There would have been nothing remarkable, but the sound murmuring through the 4 thin walls gave me goosebumps. The little radio taped to the wall was on, but what emanated from it was not music or a ball game, as I'd flippantly suggested to Vicky earlier that day. Instead, it emitted a thick band of static, and buried within it was a sing-song melody, over which was the sound of a young girl's voice, repeating phrases I couldn't understand. I crouched and listened for a few moments. Then I took out my phone, turned up the little radio, and began recording. The bizarre musical figure repeated a few times, and when I determined that it was on some sort of loop, I noted the FM band and crept back out of the playhouse, motioning Vicky toward the car. "Hey," she said quietly. She pointed toward the back door of the house that led into Van's kitchen. It was ajar. "Is that normal around here?" I whispered. "No," she said. We carefully and silently made our way toward the open doorway, and Vicky was inside before I could stop her. I made a noise in my throat, hesitant to call out, and she put her finger to her lips and glared at me. I reluctantly followed her down the hallway that led to Van's front room. Vicky held out a hand to stop me from moving forward, and we both paused. She pointed toward the living room where Van was barely visible, sitting in a lazy boy with his back to us. The curtains were drawn, and it was unreasonably dark in the front part of the house, as though the windows simply wouldn't let in light. I know that makes no sense, but I don't know how else to put it. There was a shadow of some kind against the curtains, but the source of the light wasn't something we could see from where we stood. Van was murmuring to himself, and it sounded like someone was conversing with him in a near whisper. The voice sounded female in a way, but it also sounded oddly like Van's voice. It was as though he was having a conversation with a recording of himself. That's the only way I know how to put it. The other voice popped and crackled as though it was coming from a badly scratched record. I only heard Van clearly say one phrase. "I don't know how she got in there, but you best believe I'll keep her here. I'll keep her here forever." "Van?" I called. Are you okay?" "It's Paul Harmon. Your door was open. Is everything good?" The voices abruptly stopped, and as I moved slowly into the living room, Vicky stood framed in the threshold of the back door, watching me worriedly. Van lay in his recliner, and on the TV was a blank blue screen, like when your cable isn't connected properly. Maybe what I'd heard had been the television. He stared straight ahead, and his eyes were slightly wet, as though he'd been on the verge of tears. When he saw me, he smiled softly and swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do," he said with a sad resignation in his voice. "About what?" I said. "What are you talking about, Van? Do you need us to call someone?" But he didn't respond, just staring into nothing, and I could see Vicky growing anxious down the hall. "Are you sure that my dad was never here, Van?" I held up the picture I'd found in the basement. "Did you give this to him? Or let him take it? What's in there?" I tapped the photo. "What is that inside there?" He laid his head back against the chair and closed his eyes. "It took me 30 years to figure out how to lock it up," he said. "No one else knows how. No one else knows how." He began to weep softly and waved his hand at me, indicating that I should leave. I crept back through the house, still not convinced that there wasn't another person there, and closed the back door. I stood outside the playhouse. What was I missing? It was empty, save for the little radio, but it certainly looked like there was someone inside the picture my dad had taken, and there was no lock on the door. What did Van mean about keeping someone in there? As we pulled away and headed down the road, I explained what I'd seen in the playhouse and played the recording I made for Vicky. She listened with a bewildered look on her face and finally handed my phone back, just at as much of a loss as I was. We entered downtown Chancellor again, and I pulled into a spot in front of the Gold Star. We sat there in silence for a few seconds, both of us processing whatever we'd just seen and not seen at Van's house. Felt like I'd been awake for a week, given everything that the day had entailed since I first arrived in Chancellor. I offered to drive Vicky to her car where she'd left it near the pizza place, as I wanted to spend a little more time going through my dad's basement of curiosities, and I couldn't really explain why, but I wanted to do it alone. I thanked her, waited until she drove away, and headed back across town, stopping at a grocery store for a few staples, some drinks, snacks, sandwich stuff, and thankfully they had an aisle of general home goods, so I bought a new pair of cheap bed sheets as well before heading back to my dad's new house. I also took inventory of the newspaper rack near the checkout lanes, which featured 4 different newspapers, only one of which was national. The other 3 were from Peoria, Macomb, and Quincy, and they all featured articles about Margaret Summers on the front page, so I bought them all. I didn't like anything about the day, except for Vicky's company, and the more I thought about dragging her into this whole thing, whatever it was, the more it felt juvenile, even a little reckless. My dad was gone, another child was gone, and now I had all these photos and articles and stuff relating to other missing kids, missing people, disasters, seemingly unknown phenomena, as ridiculous as it felt to even consider such a thing. It was as though a wall of tissue paper separating all of that from reality was just dissolving in front of me as I looked at the photos of Margaret Summers splashed across the pile of newsprint on my front seat. I listened to the recording I made at Van's again, then again, and though I didn't feel it quite the same as I had back at the site of that church fire, the nauseating pull of that reedy, keening sound I'd heard in the air earlier that day hit me out of nowhere. I pulled my car around the back of the Rudder Mill house on the opposite side from the highway. I couldn't explain why, I just wasn't wild about the idea of someone immediately seeing my car there. If my dad had been there recently, and if anyone in town knew him, saw him, suspected him of anything, it just felt weird to call attention to my being there. All things considered, the former Parsons house wasn't bad. It was dated, certainly, but in a way that, I don't know, brought me some comfort, particularly the canisters on the kitchen counter noting coffee, tea, sugar, flour, the metallic sunburst clock in the living room, a 60s holdover if ever there was one. It reminded me in a weird way of my grandparents' house where I'd spent a lot of time as a kid. I went through it room by room, slowly, alone, and while it wasn't up to date, I couldn't say that it wasn't homey in its way. It was mostly lamplight, which was comfortable. I hated overhead fluorescent light. When I sat down on the aging couch, complete with a flowery yellow pattern that must have seemed attractive to someone at some point, it felt like I was existing in some vaguely pleasant way, out of time. My dad had organized certain piles of newspaper articles and clippings in file folders, as I said, and only some of them had dates. So I spent an hour or so integrating the articles I'd found in his Galesburg office with what was here at the Rudder Mill house so that there was at least some consistent chronological order to things, even if it remained incomplete. I figured it made the most sense to start there, beyond what we'd already found and identified as notable earlier. The clippings I was able to compile seemed to start as far back as 1947, and the majority of them were from either the Peoria Journal-Star or the Quincy Register, with a few others thrown in. An independent paper from Galesburg called The Streak, and even a short piece or two from the Western Illinois University student newspaper in Macomb. The first article clearly related to Chancellor that I could see was a quick paragraph on a soldier named Adam Hamas, who had returned from Korea to his hometown of Chancellor in 1957 and committed suicide in 1959. The family blamed the stress of war. He was given a military funeral, buried in a little cemetery just east of town, and that was that. What followed that was a series of clippings, in some cases headline stories, and in some cases just a follow-up blurb, related to the disappearances of 13 unrelated people between 1955 and 1970. Donald Reynolds, the first, from what I could see, had been 9 years old, and she was from Chancellor. There were 3 more from Chancellor during that time, and the others were from the surrounding area: Peoria, Elston, Horace, Gurney, Desmond, Bethel, as well as a town just over the Missouri border called Enos. Little information was given in each instance. Just a kid who went missing while playing in a park or riding a bike home for dinner. No leads, no suspects, no trace. Then came the same clipping I'd seen at the library, announcing the first annual Rudder Mill Festival in Chancellor back in '74, and attached to those was a short, simple obituary for an 11-year-old kid named Clement McGill, dated just a few days after the fest took place. It offered no insight as to the nature of his death, but it didn't take much to connect the article I'd seen suggesting a tragedy at the festival, and now this child's obituary. I needed to find out more about Clement McGill. There were some additional articles from Gina Burns, the name I'd come to recognize immediately, most of which were fluff pieces about meaningless local happenings in Baldwin, McDonough, and Adams counties. But there was one in particular from 1971 where my dad had circled the headline. 5 years later, who is Indrid Cold? The title asked, and under it was the same rough sketch of the round-faced, smiling man I'd seen in the Mothman book from the motel. The article went on to provide the basic history of Woodrow Derenberger's supposed encounters with the otherworldly figure who identified himself as Indrid Cold and was spotted around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, around the same time as the widely reported Mothman. At the end of the article, Burns noted that the situation seemed remarkably similar to the, quote, school bus incident the previous fall outside of Desmond, Illinois, but it offered little more as to what that meant. Next to the article's title, my dad had written John in all caps, and he'd underlined it twice. Then there was the article on Tanner Parsons' disappearance, how she'd gone missing around the 16th of December in 1973, how the local police hoped someone would come forward with information. After that were a few articles on construction projects in Chancellor, nothing I could reasonably piece together in any fashion, followed by an article about the McCann Glass Factory closing its doors in 1984, and another short article on the first congressional church fire that same year. According to the short piece, the cause of the church blaze was unclear, but it quickly caught the vestments on the altar and set the rest of the wooden structure up in a matter of minutes. Some witnesses said it was the result of candles falling over. One witness claimed that it was the result of someone entering the church from behind the pulpit and actually starting a fire. The minister at the time, a Reverend Charles Valen, was questioned, but no definitive cause was known. The Illinois map at the center of the big corkboard had notes scribbled all over it, along with the symbol my dad claimed to have seen carved into Tanner's skin, and that dotted his notebooks from one end to the other, as well as others that seemed similar, as though part of a shared symbolic language. There were photos of that symbol and others graffitied on brick walls, carved into trees, scratched in dirt, in one case smeared on someone's front door in a liquid I couldn't identify. There were angles written on the map next to some of the towns. Geometric angle measurements, including a town called Gurney, about 20 miles south of Chancellor. Here and there were photos of people clipped from newspapers. I recognized Tanner, but there were others noted by name. Sarah Noel, Pamela Albright, Evelyn Garwood, for whom I had no context. I stared at the wall, the smiling faces of these strangers, the strings that connected to the map. I suddenly felt very small. I thought of the phrase people used about feeling someone walk over their grave, and it occurred to me in that moment that I knew what they meant. The sudden feeling that the space you occupied, the space your mind occupied, that you took for granted as a private place, was somehow not just yours anymore. I took out my phone and snapped pictures of everything I could, not really knowing why beyond just what seemed like a fragility to having it all here in one place, a place I didn't know. And it was then when I heard a hard thump at the door. I looked at my phone. It was 15 minutes to 11. Hours had passed. From the top of the basement stairs, the front door was mostly visible, and I saw what looked like a shadow outside. But by the time I got down the hall and opened the door, there was no one there. That's when I realized that the sound could have come from the back door, as it all sounded the same from downstairs. I looked through a kitchen window to see the figure of a man moving across the field behind the barn, headed for that thick patch of woods. In the moonlight, I watched him stride casually over the landscape without looking back. A tallish, lanky man in fitted clothes, carrying something under his arm. I ran to the back door, yanked the chair out of the way to free the knob, and made my way outside. He was far enough ahead and must have been moving quickly enough to make it impossible for me to catch up, because I was still a good 20 yards behind when he passed through the wall of trees and into the cover of the forest. I could see his shape for a few seconds, and then he was too far in. The woods were darker than I could even comprehend. It was that feeling from the night before at the motel came back, just creeping over my flesh. God, it was so easy to forget, living in a city, just how quiet the rest of the world could be in the dead of night. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I knew that I probably didn't have long before I wouldn't be able to see much of anything anyway, and there were undoubtedly wild animals, but on the other hand, I'd had enough of the questions on top of questions for one day. I picked up my pace and passed into the trees. The totality of the woods was probably no more than 20 acres before the trees got thinner on the far northeast side, but just inside the growth, the moonlight died. I could smell vegetation and a slight change to the air and the way that sound traveled. I stepped carefully, trying to keep from making any noise, and I looked all around me with every other step for the man. I didn't see him anywhere, but it wouldn't have been hard to beat a quick, careful path through the trees to get out of sight if you knew where you were going. Though if his goal had been to get me to answer the door, I wasn't sure why suddenly avoiding me made any sense either. Rationally, I thought maybe he was camping, or hunting, and needed some help. Hunting. 11 o'clock at night, yeah, I mean, that's... You look for anything, you know, to make sense of things when nothing makes sense, right? I had to stop letting the arcane weirdness of my dad's notes and clippings get to me, I thought, though I felt like a foolish consideration as I paused and scanned the woods with my flashlight. There were skitters and chirps from the inhabitants of those woods whose territory I'd invaded. Raccoons, possums, probably skunks. Shadows gave birth to shadows that bent into angles, that bent into new angles, and it occurred to me, for maybe the wrong reasons, why people stuffed their belongings into a sack and sought out such places to camp or explore. Isolation. Perhaps a measuring of one's fitness against the natural world that was there to be had if you could take it on. I paused when I reached a kind of clearing, a dead spot in the forest where the trees suddenly gave way to a total lack of vegetation for about 10 yards in a loose circle. The forest floor didn't look tamped down as though someone had camped or anything of that nature. It was simply a broad open space where nothing grew. There were scorch marks at what looked to be patterned intervals arranged also in a circle, and I instinctively moved behind a tree a little as I studied the clearing. There was an upright shape behind a tree opposite where I stood. A tall human shape, or at least close to it. It was as though someone too big was trying to hide behind a tree, but there was nothing playful about it. It stood unmoving, arms visible around the sides of the tree, and part of a head and shoulders slightly visible as well. I waited for them to move, but it didn't, not even a little. It just stood there, absurdly still, like in a cartoon when Bugs Bunny hides behind something that's clearly too small to hide behind. The animal dumbness of it made my skin crawl, as though I could be fooled by someone simply pretending they couldn't be seen. I began to slowly move backward, retracing my steps as I raised my phone, snapping a quick shot of the clearing before turning and quickly moving from tree to try and stay as invisible as possible as I made my way back to the tree line, crouching intermittently, stupidly, as though that would hide me from whomever this was I'd followed into the woods. When I made it back into that expansive field that led to the house, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I forced myself to suck in breaths of fresh air, that rotten vegetation smell slowly leaving my nostrils. I let myself back inside the house, locked the door behind me, and went to the kitchen window, where I watched the woods for what felt like an hour. It was nothing. I was overreacting. Most certainly overreacting. I'd probably just seen a misshapen tree, for Christ's sake. I took out my phone and looked at the picture, zooming in at various points to try and identify anything. It was a little blurry, as I'd been quick and hadn't even looked at the screen, but it captured the size of the clearing pretty well, though it looked as though the flash had perhaps distorted the image. I zoomed in on the area where it seemed someone had been hiding, and it was tough to make out the colors as everything past the clearing and the photo sort of ran together. But I was almost certain, as I scanned the photo, that I could see terribly mutilated fingers at the end of an arm, partially hidden behind that tree. After wedging the chair under the back doorknob again, and doing the same to the front, I locked myself in one of the bedrooms upstairs and had a fitful sleep, not conking out until 1 in the morning and waking sometime shortly before the sun came up. The fact that Rich had bought this house seemed beyond obsessed to me, though without the full story it was hard to say exactly. I wouldn't say that I've been someone who buys into ghosts and shit like that, not as a general rule. I guess I hadn't really thought about it much. It's not the kind of thing that really warrants evaluation for most people on any kind of regular basis. It was like asking someone if they believed in aliens. You know, usually people gave you a quick answer, a hard yes or a hard no. But in most cases, unless you were dealing with a scholar or a nut job, they'd have a hard time telling you why they believed what they believed on either side. So for all of that, and in the light of morning, much of what was in the basement seemed like someone's attempts to draw connections between unrelated events. I tried to hit the reset switch. I spent most of the day exploring Chancellor a bit further and trying to compare what I saw with the notes my dad had compiled in the basement. I drove past the former site of McCann Glass, that massive blocks-long warehouse that had been covered in graffiti of all shapes and sizes. Why it hadn't been razed was beyond me. I went back to the library and looked up anything I could find on Clement McGill, but it was largely a bust, just the obit and a mention of him winning a science fair award in 3rd grade. I bought a few comics for Patty at the comic store downtown, which was charming if a bit thin on inventory, and I had a club sandwich at the Gold Star while listening and watching the activity around me. At no point did I feel unwelcome. In fact, more than a handful of strangers said hello to me and made some small talk as they exited the diner. I got a refill on my coffee to go, and had planned on heading back to the house to continue my slog through Rich's notes, but on a whim, I swung back down Calendar Road, and I sat there for a bit, sipping my coffee and watching Van's house. On one hand, I felt almost guilty, as he hadn't done anything specifically threatening to us, though whatever scene was unfolding in his house that previous night when we'd gone back suggested something firmly wrong in some way, though I also knew it was human nature and all too easy to take things out of context. I don't know, for all I knew, maybe the old guy had dementia, right? I watched for a bit and saw Van moving around his house, from the kitchen to the living room and back again, but beyond that, there was little to go on. I couldn't figure out why Rich had taken a picture of that playhouse, but it would have been easy to creep around back from the other side of the highway, just as I had done. Snap a pic and get out of there. Maybe Van was telling the truth about never having met my dad. I went back to the Rudder Mill house, packaged up Patty's comics to mail out, then sat on the back steps, watching the wooded expanse beyond the property line for a long time, until it began to get dark. The Point House Tap was a divey little tavern with neon beer signs in the window and a tired, illuminated sign with the bar's logo offering the only light on the dark highway. It reminded me of 1,000 little places along 1,000 rural highways that I'd seen over the years on family trips to Wisconsin, Tennessee, all over the Midwest. A couple of grizzled guys played pool, slightly lit and looking old beyond their years. The bartender leaned on the countertop and watched a rerun of The Honeymooners on a boxy old color TV that hung over the far end of the bottle racks. I sipped a beer and considered the events of the last couple of days, trying to calm my brain down. I was still hoping for a rational explanation behind whatever was happening with my dad, but that seemed to be slipping further away. Someone squeezed my shoulder, and I was relieved as Vicky appeared next to me. She signaled the bartender, who smiled and nodded, and she sat down next to me. As the bartender arrived with her beer, I told her about the rest of the things in my dad's basement and my visitor from the woods. She shook her head when I showed her the one picture I'd taken, then frowned. She said it didn't look like anything to her. I thanked her for her help the day before, and we clinked bottles. I asked her how long she'd been teaching, and she said she'd been at it for 18 years, that she did a brief run in art school before realizing she didn't want to teach art history, and that was about as far as potential careers went. And, she added, I don't think you have to be a pro at something to call yourself a part of it. I told her I knew a lot of indie bands who would agree with her, and she asked about my story, how I ended up in Chicago working for a studio. I told her how I'd played guitars for some metal and punk bands in high school and college, how my mom had taught piano for a while. Like any teenager at the time, I got really into music, thought I was going to be a rock star. Ended up getting married, having a kid, didn't want to be on the road all the time like my dad had been, and that was that. Look, Vicky said finally, I know that you want to make sense of all this, Paul. Your dad's notes, the house, his trips out here. Maybe they mean something, maybe they don't. I know what it's like to try to figure out your parents as you get older. They do things sometimes that just don't seem to make sense. You just feel different from them in some way, and the older you get, the harder you try to make pieces fit. I couldn't argue with her, and I told her as much. I nodded in thanks as the bartender set another beer in front of me. Dad was a bit paranoid, I said. Always was. He loved conspiracy theories, but in a lighthearted way, right? Not like this. I don't know. Vicky, there's something here. There's something here to be had. I mean, the thing in the woods aside, I didn't really see a thing. She cut in gently. Okay, sure, right, I replied. Maybe nothing. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm a little paranoid too. Maybe this has me all just a little freaked out. I unfolded an article I'd brought and flattened it on the bar. Check this out. 1982. You were in grade school, right? Yeah, she replied. I read the headline of the article. What scares you about Halloween? Oh yeah, I remember these things, she said. They'd ask 3 or 4 kids a question, then they'd put it in the newsletters for parents they'd send home. Cutesy shit for the most part, you know. Read the responses, I said. She sat up in her chair, narrating in her teacher voice. What scares you about Halloween? Charlie Bowers, age 10. That movie about the Texas chainsaws. Natalie Cleary, age 8. Witches. Billy Mitchell, age 7. My brother's motorcycle. It's too loud and he revs it up to scare me. Billy Mitchell's brother sounds like a jewel. Sarah Carson, age 9. I saw Cantor eating birds outside my grandma's house. Vicky paused. Whoa. I think I remember being in school with Sarah Carson, and maybe Natalie. I tapped the paper. My point is, you and your mom weren't the only ones who knew about Cantor. For what that's worth. Well, yeah, she shrugged. Like I said, it was a boogeyman story. Every town has its urban legends and weird history, and kids are kids, you know? I deal with them 9 months out of the year, every day. Believe me, there's some bizarre stuff that comes out of their heads, especially in a place like this where there's nothing to do. Hell, I used to have an imaginary friend named Stuart, according to my mom. I don't even remember it. Stuart and I apparently had tea parties, played Indiana Jones, the whole nine. That may be, I argued, but someone knocked on my door earlier. Fine, the picture sucks, but I followed this guy into the woods and I saw something in there. I don't know what it was, who it was, what it was. I don't know. There was this burned out area in the middle, a big clearing. There were, I don't know. I could sense movement. You know, I think whoever it was knew I was there. It's probably just kids camping, you know, she said. Trying to drink and get it on, and you interrupted them. I worked at a nursing home in college in Macomb. The residents there said and did more questionably odd stuff than we ran across today. But I get where you're coming from. I do. Look, it's been a strange couple of days. Everyone's anxious. This Margaret thing has everyone's heads a little off. We sat in silence for a few minutes, and the credits rolled on the TV over our heads. The intro to The Twilight Zone filled the screen with twinkling stars and floating eyeballs as Vicky turned to me with a mischievous smile. You want to see something cool? She asked. 15 minutes later, I sat on a concrete bench in a circular sunken plaza in Sunset Park, a massive park on the east side of town that mainly consisted of a baseball diamond for local games and a large fenced-off grassy commons. The plaza where we sat was about 12 feet deep, accessible by a set of concrete stairs on either end and home to a big fire pit in the middle. And also accompanying the plaza were 4 animal sculptures built entirely out of bottles. Beer bottles, soda bottles, mason jars, anything in between. There was a wolf, a horse, a deer, and a large bird with its wings spread. The colors of the bottles would occasionally twinkle a bit, reflecting the slightest bit of light passing over the park from cars off of Ruddermill Road, and Vicky sat cross-legged on the ground near the wolf, whose snout looked suspiciously like a former Heineken. This is interesting, I laughed, nursing a third beer, and Vicky raised hers in toast with a smile. Welcome to the pit, she said. We've cornered the market on amusing ourselves here. This was the place to be in high school. A lot of teenage romances took form down here, let me tell you. And probably gave birth to a whole bunch of small-town alcoholics, but I guess that's another story. And probably pregnancies. And maybe the occasional STD, I suggested. And a lot of weed. Correct on all counts, Vicky grinned. Nice mural, I offered. The concrete walls of the pit featured a zigzagging mess of characters and bubbly letters, the product of what looked like decades of teenage humor and angst, thrown about in garish, bright spray paint. I'm not sure what the hell it is, but you know, it adds character. What is that thing? Ah, she exclaimed, standing and waving a fake pointer at it as though she were presenting. This is actually from my era. This friend of ours, what the hell was his name? Garrett, I think. My friend Michelle was totally in love with him for years, right? Even though he had this really patchy, weird-looking beard he kept attempting to grow. Anyway, we were all out here one night, and he was out here all the time, like 5 nights a week. Loitering as a job, basically. So he and his buddy had been tagging railroad crossings or something. They had all this spray paint, and he's standing up against that piece of wall right there. Michelle picks up the can of paint like she's going to spray him, so he flattens himself against the wall, and she spray paints his outline like that. He was like, well, fair enough. I'm never leaving Chancellor. I might as well be the steward of the abandoned brickyards, even if it's just in paint form. Vicky leaned against the wall and smiled to herself at the memory. I can't believe that's still here. To Garrett, I said, raising my bottle. And who's responsible for the beer bottle banana splits here? This was the product of a grant, believe it or not, she laughed. Local artists back in the early 2000s built this thing. It was supposed to be some sort of commentary on the beauty of recycling, I think. As it is, it's just this, well, you can see, weird, kind of tacky thing. But everyone loves it. She closed her eyes and smiled. God, it seems like so long ago when we were all sitting down here getting stoned and just blasting music, you know? Let me guess, I said. Dead Kennedys? Close, she sneered, raising her bottle again. I was more of a Susie Sue girl, more goth than punk. I remember my cousin came for Thanksgiving one year, and she brought a Christian Death tape, helped me dye my hair pink on one side, blue on the other. They sent me home from school. Same thing happened to me with Slayer tape, I laughed. I had a teacher try to give me Saturday detention just for the cover of Rain and Blood by itself. Like I drew the damn thing, right? Yeah, it feels like about 1,000 years ago. We had a strip in high school. There was a big parking lot right in the middle of our cruising strip, right? We'd cruise from Steak and Shake to the McDonald's all the way on the other side of town and back again, just over and over. I mean, like 20 or 30 times. That was our whole life. We reminisced for a little while longer, then finished our beers, and I told her I'd drive her back to her car at the Point House. As we turned out onto Ruddermill Road and started to head east toward the bar, Vicky pointed the opposite direction. Look, she said. There were two people walking down the highway together, side by side, but in the dark it was nearly impossible to see who they were. Is that Van? I turned off my headlights, then turned left on Rudder Mill and cruised along the highway shoulder, watching the two men grow smaller as they cut through a field just in front of us. Turn here, Vicky said, and I took a right, heading down a short gravel road toward the massive husk of McCann glass. Van and his companion cut toward the looming warehouse, and I kicked up my speed just a little so I could swing around the backside of the parking lot without being seen. Once we were there, I pulled around the side, out of sight from the main highway, and we got out, easing our car doors shut so as not to cause unnecessary noise, making our way to the side of the building. The two figures approached the parking lot, cutting across, and headed for what used to be the employee entrance, just around the corner from where we stood in the dark, waiting. Van turned on a flashlight, tucking it under his arm as he messed with the door handle, and the beam of light bounced around as he worked the door free. Oh my God, Vicky hissed next to me. That's him. That's who? I replied. That's the man, Paul, she said. The man who used to travel with your dad. The guy with Van. That's him.
You have been listening to Cicatrix, Episode 4, Through These Open Windows. Cicatrix is a production of Sensory Eclipse Media with funding from the estate of Vincent Galt and has been transcribed and produced by Christopher Bevard. For more information on this and other podcasts from Sensory Eclipse, as well as more information regarding the ongoing mystery of Richard Harmon's disappearance, please visit www.sensoryeclipse.com. Original music and score by the Crone Hex. Check them out at thecronehex.bandcamp.com. Thank you for listening.